In February of 2021, the state of Texas lost power for days during one of the worst winter storms in its history. Temperatures dropped below zero in places that had not seen that kind of cold in 70 years. More than 4.5 million homes went dark. Furnaces shut off. Space heaters stopped working. Pipes froze and burst inside walls. And in the chaos that followed, at least 246 people died, though independent researchers estimate the real number may be closer to 700. Almost two-thirds of the official deaths were caused by hypothermia. People froze to death inside their own homes, not in the wilderness, not on a mountaintop, in suburban living rooms, in apartment buildings, in a state that produces more energy than almost any place on Earth. The grid failed, and millions of people realized they had no idea how to stay warm without it. Over 300 cases of carbon monoxide poisoning were reported as people desperately ran cars in closed garages, fired up charcoal grills indoors, and tried to heat rooms with gas ovens that were never designed for that purpose. An 11-year-old boy in Conroe, where the temperature hit 12 degrees, died of hypothermia after his home had been without power for 2 days. That is the part nobody wants to say out loud. We did not just lose power during that storm. We lost the knowledge that would have kept people alive, the kind of knowledge that carried families through winters far worse than that one for thousands of years without a single watt of electricity. What follows are the methods that actually work. Some of them are ancient. Some of them are surprisingly simple. A few of them will change the way you think about heat forever. And not one of them requires a plug. The first thing your grandparents understood about surviving cold without power is something most modern Americans have completely forgotten. You do not heat a house, you heat a room. The average American home today is about 2,400 square feet. That is an enormous volume of air to keep warm, and the moment your furnace dies, all of that space becomes a liability. Every extra room is a place where warmth is bleeding away through windows, through walls, through doors that nobody bothered to close. During the 1940s, when fuel rationing hit hard across the country, families pulled mattresses into the kitchen, hung heavy blankets over doorways, and stuffed rolled towels under every crack and threshold they could find. They closed off bedrooms, hallways, and parlors without a second thought. They shrank their living space down to the smallest area they could manage and kept every scrap of warmth trapped inside it. The physics behind this are not complicated. A 1,500 square foot home takes roughly 40,000 BTUs per hour to heat in freezing weather. A single room of 200 square feet takes a fraction of that. Body heat alone from 4 people generates about 1,600 BTUs per hour. In a small enough space with blankets hung over the windows and towels blocking every draft, that body heat alone can mean the difference between 50 degrees inside and 35. One family in Utah tested this during a deliberate winter power shutoff experiment. They sealed off their family room with blankets in the hallway, stuffed towels under the doors, and found that even without any alternative heat source at all, their body heat and a handful of candles kept the room survivable for 4 days straight. It was not comfortable. The mother admitted later that the cold hadn't brought out the best in her. But they made it through. After the 1964 Great Alaskan Earthquake, which measured a 9.2 on the Richter scale, a family survived the freezing aftermath without any heat source by setting up a camping tent inside their living room. The tent trapped their body heat in an even smaller pocket of air. Pioneer families used the same idea with bed curtains. Thick fabric draped around the bed frame on all 4 sides, creating a tiny insulated chamber that held warmth through the night. children slept 3 and 4 to a mattress, not because there were not enough beds, but because the shared body heat was the difference between shivering until dawn and sleeping soundly. Since heat rises, the children's loft above the main room was always the warmest place in the house, and that was no accident. The lesson here is not romantic, it is purely mechanical. Heat is energy, and energy flows from warm to cold without exception. The smaller your warm space, the less energy bleeds away. The more bodies sharing that space, the more free heat you are producing. Your great-grandparents did not need a physics textbook to understand this. They just called it common sense. And yet, when the power went out in Texas, millions of people sat in dark, freezing 2,000-square-foot houses with every door open and every room losing heat into the night because nobody had told them the most basic survival principle in the history of cold weather. Close the doors, seal the gaps, get small, get together. That one idea, which costs nothing and requires no equipment whatsoever, could have saved lives, and it was common knowledge in every farmhouse in America less than 100 years ago. This kind of knowledge gets tracked down every single week. Methods that worked for generations got dismissed and are now being quietly rediscovered by the same people who ignored them. If this is the kind of thing that matters to you and you are not yet subscribed, now is a good time. We are just getting started here. Now, here is where something beautiful happens when you pair that small space strategy with an old trick that costs almost nothing. Thermal mass. That is a term engineers throw around today, but your great-grandmother just called it a hot brick. For centuries, families heated dense, heavy objects near a fire and then carried that stored warmth wherever they needed it. Soapstone was the gold standard. In the 1800s, families placed carved blocks of soapstone near the fire or inside the door of their wood-burning stove, let them absorb heat for 20 or 30 minutes, then wrapped them in flannel or quilted covers and tucked them into the foot of the bed. A good soapstone held its warmth clean through to morning. It did not leak. It did not catch fire. It did not need a cord or a battery. The reason soapstone works so well comes down to its extraordinary density. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it even slower, radiating a gentle, steady warmth for hours without ever getting dangerously hot to the touch. Regular clay bricks work too, though they cool faster. Smooth river rocks were common in many households, though experienced families knew that porous stones could trap water inside and crack or even explode when heated, so they chose their stones carefully. Soapstones were so valued that they had their own flannel carrying sleeves and were handed down through families like good cast iron. People tucked them inside coats for winter sleigh rides. One newspaper from the era noted that soapstones were the forerunner of the automobile heater and had never once been accused of giving off carbon monoxide. Churches in colonial New England had no heating whatsoever, and families arrived on Sunday mornings carrying foot warmers, small wooden-framed tin boxes filled with hot coals or heated stones, which they set beneath their feet during sermons that could stretch 3 hours in the dead of January. Some of the wealthier churches had enclosed pews built like small wooden rooms, specifically so families could bring their warmers inside and trap the heat under heavy lap blankets. In many congregations, the foot warmer was the only heat to be found on a bitter Sunday morning. During the fuel rationing of 1944, newspapers ran articles reminding people to dig their grandparents' old soapstones out of the attic because heating fuel was growing scarce. One columnist wrote that Grandpa, with his soapstone and a flannel wrapper, was just as much of a comfort seeker as his grandson with an electric blanket, and a good deal more reliable when the power went out. What that means in practical terms is this: you do not need to heat the air in a room to stay warm. You can heat a single dense object, bring it close to your body, and let it radiate warmth directly into you for hours. It is targeted heat, personal heat. And it works as well right now as it did 200 years ago for the price of one brick and one towel. If your grandmother used to do something like this, or if you grew up in a house where bricks went into the oven before bedtime, say something in the comments. A lot of you carry knowledge that has never been written down anywhere, and the comment section might be the only place it gets preserved. If this brought back a memory, tell us about it. But here is what nobody tells you about the material you should be wrapping that hot stone in, and the material you should be wearing on your body the moment the power goes out. Not all fabrics are equal when temperatures drop, and the one material that outperforms everything else in a true cold weather emergency is the one the modern world nearly walked away from: wool. Your ancestors did not wear wool because they lacked better options. They wore it because nothing else came close, and 8,000 years after humans first domesticated sheep, the science still agrees with them. Wool fibers have a natural crimp, thousands of tiny bends in every single strand, and those bends create small pockets of trapped air throughout the fabric. That trapped air is what insulates, the same principle that makes double-pane windows effective, but the real magic happens when wool gets wet. Unlike cotton, which soaks up moisture like a sponge and then conducts heat straight away from your body, wool can absorb up to 30% of its own weight in water before it even feels damp to the touch. And here is the part that sounds almost impossible until you see the data. When wool absorbs that moisture, a chemical reaction occurs inside the fibers themselves. Hydrogen bonds in the water molecules break down during a process scientists call heat absorption, and that reaction generates measurable warmth. In controlled laboratory tests, 1 kilogram of merino wool produced roughly the same amount of heat energy over 8 hours as a standard electric blanket. That is not a metaphor. That is published, peer-reviewed data. Put simply, wool does not just keep warmth in. It makes its own warmth when conditions turn wet and cold, which is precisely the moment every other fabric fails you. Cotton does the opposite. Survival instructors have a grim saying about cotton in freezing weather. They say cotton kills. It is not an exaggeration. Wet cotton pressed against your skin pulls heat away from your body at a devastating rate, and wet skin can lose heat up to 25 times faster than dry skin. Wool fights that process at every level. It resists saturation, maintains its structure when damp, and actively produces heat as it dries. There is a reason that, for thousands of years, every military in every cold weather nation on Earth issued wool uniforms to its soldiers. We replaced wool with polyester and nylon fleece because those were cheaper to produce and easier to manufacture at scale, not because they performed better. In fact, in independent testing, a soaking wet wool blanket still insulates better than no blanket at all because the fiber structure maintains tiny air pockets even when saturated. Cotton collapses flat when wet and becomes nothing more than a cold, heavy sheet of fabric pressed against your skin. If you take nothing else from this, take this. When the power goes out and the temperature starts dropping, put on wool first. A wool hat alone can slow heat loss from your head significantly. The United States Forest Service has stated that up to 50% of body heat can escape through an uncovered head. Wool socks, a wool sweater, a wool blanket wrapped around your shoulders. That is your first and most reliable line of defense. And if you happen to find an old wool army blanket at a surplus store or in your grandfather's closet, grab it and never let it go. Those blankets were issued for a reason. They weighed about 4 pounds. They were dense and tightly woven, and they kept soldiers alive through 2 world wars and Korea. You can still find them for $10 or $15 if you know where to look. That is the best $15 you will ever spend on emergency preparedness. Now, so let me tell you about a source of completely free heat that most people walk past every single day without ever giving it a thought. Sunlight. Even in winter, even in places that get heavy snow, there are usually hours each day when the sun breaks through. And if you have south-facing windows in your home, you already have a passive solar collector built right into the wall. The principle goes back further than recorded history. The ancient Romans oriented their public baths to face south and actually passed laws protecting a citizen's access to sunlight for heating. The Anasazi people of the American Southwest built cliff dwellings under south-facing overhangs that caught the low winter sun and shaded out the harsh summer heat, a design so effective that modern architects study it today. Dense materials inside a room, concrete floors, stone walls, brick fireplaces, ceramic tile absorb solar energy during daylight hours and then release that stored heat back into the room slowly as the air cools after sunset. Heat migrates through a masonry wall at an average rate of about 1 inch per hour. What that means in real terms is this. Sunlight hitting an 8-inch concrete wall at noon will begin warming the inside of your room around 8 in the evening, right when the temperature drops and you need it most. This is not speculation. A house in Ondol, France, built in 1967 with nothing more than a south-facing concrete wall painted black behind a double layer of glass, got 70% of its annual heating from sunlight alone, confirmed by data collected over multiple winters. During a power outage, you can put this to work immediately. Open every south-facing curtain during the day and let sunlight pour onto your floors and walls. If those floors are bare concrete, stone, or tile, clear them of rugs and furniture so they can absorb as much energy as possible. At night, close the curtains tight, or better yet, hang heavy blankets over the glass to trap the stored heat inside. If your floors are carpet or hardwood, set dark-colored containers of water in the path of the sun. Water stores even more heat per volume than concrete does, and those containers will radiate warmth into the room for hours after the sun sets. Even a row of gallon jugs filled with water and set along a sunny wall will make a measurable difference by evening. We pay utility companies hundreds of dollars a month for heat that the sun delivers to our windows at no charge. Our ancestors would find that baffling. We spent a long time putting together a guide for people like you, people who understand that the old ways worked and who want all of this in one place, organized, detailed, and ready to use. If you are watching on your phone or computer, the link is right below. If you are watching on your TV, grab your phone and point the camera at the code on screen. Every year, more of this disappears. This is how we make sure it does not. Now, here is where it gets genuinely remarkable. Everything we have covered so far involves conserving your own body heat or passively capturing a little warmth from the sun. But there are entire cultures that solve the heating problem so completely that a brief morning fire kept an entire family warm until the next day, using nothing but bricks and clever engineering. The Russian masonry stove, called a pechka, has been the center of Russian domestic life since at least the 1500s. It is not a stove the way you picture one. It is an enormous structure made entirely of brick, typically weighing between 1 and 2 tons, placed in the very center of the home, so it can radiate heat in every direction. Inside the stove, a labyrinth of winding channels called kolania, which translates roughly to bends, forces the hot smoke and combustion gases to travel a long, twisting path through the brickwork before they reach the chimney. As the gases wind through those channels, the bricks absorb nearly all of the heat energy. The outer surface of the stove stays warm, but safe to touch, usually between 100 and 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and it radiates that warmth steadily into the living space for 18 to 24 hours after the fire goes out. One builder in the Pacific Northwest who constructed a masonry heater based on this design reported that after a single 2-hour morning fire, his house temperature dropped only 3 to 4 degrees overnight, even in the coldest stretch of the winter. Load it once, light it once, walk away. You are warm until tomorrow. The Russians did not just heat with the pechka, they cooked on it. They dried mushrooms and herbs on its flat surfaces. They slept on top of it, on a built-in sleeping platform called a polot, where the bricks stayed warm all night. On the coldest evenings, the whole family climbed up, and the men who knew how to build these stoves properly, the pechniki, were among the most respected tradesmen in any village. A badly built pechka smoked, cracked, and wasted fuel. A well-built one was the difference between surviving a Russian winter and not surviving it. Meanwhile, in a typical American fireplace, as much as 90% of the heat goes straight up the chimney. We traded the masonry stove for the open hearth because it looked prettier. And then we made it worse by adding a forced air system that pumps heated air through leaky ductwork, losing 20 to 30% of its energy before it ever reaches the room. We spend hundreds of dollars a month on heat that our great-great-grandparents captured for free with a pile of bricks and some firewood. The irony would almost be funny if people had not died for the lack of this knowledge. Modern fire brick, the same kind used in commercial pizza ovens, stores 80% more heat than cast iron and conducts it 45 times more slowly. That combination of high storage and slow release is exactly what makes masonry heating work. The bricks soak up everything the fire gives and then hand it back to the room gently for hours, long after the last ember has gone cold. It is not ancient superstition. It is thermodynamics, proven by centuries of use and confirmed by every engineer who has bothered to study it. Somewhere right now there is someone in your life who would want to know all of this. A sibling who heats with wood. A friend who has always believed the old ways had something that modern shortcuts are missing. Send it to them. You will not need to explain why. They will understand the moment it starts. That same principle of burning a small amount of fuel at extreme efficiency and storing the heat in massive thermal mass has been taken even further by a modern invention that almost nobody has heard of. The rocket mass heater. The design burns wood inside a heavily insulated combustion chamber where temperatures reach well over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, the smoke itself becomes additional fuel, the creosote, the soot, the unburned gases that normally drift up a conventional chimney and waste energy. All of it combusts inside the insulated chamber. The hot exhaust then travels through a long horizontal duct buried inside a massive bench made of cob or masonry or packed earth. By the time the gases exit through a small pipe on the far end, they have surrendered nearly all their heat to the bench. The exhaust comes out barely warmer than the room. People who heat with rocket mass systems consistently report using 80 to 90% less wood than they used with a conventional stove. One homesteader described how his old woodshed used to be stuffed full every autumn and still ran short before spring. After building a rocket mass heater, half the shed now lasts him 3 full winters. You sit on the heated bench. You sleep against it. Your children do homework on it while the warmth soaks through. It is furniture that heats your entire home. Some people have built them for as little as $50 using salvaged bricks and scrap metal. They remain relatively unknown, partly because local building codes have not caught up, and partly because the claims sound too good to be true, but the physics is well understood, and thousands of families are quietly heating this way right now for almost nothing, all winter long. We went from masonry stoves that heated homes on a single fire to rocket mass heaters that do it with 1/10 of the wood. And instead of celebrating this as a breakthrough, we buried it under building codes written for a world that assumes everyone will always have access to cheap natural gas. That assumption nearly killed hundreds of people in Texas. It could happen again anywhere, to anyone, on any grid, in any winter. But perhaps the most extraordinary heating system ever conceived by human beings requires no stove at all, no chimney, no bench, just flat stone, a cooking fire, and a depth of understanding about heat that we can barely comprehend today. The Korean Ondol, which translates simply to warm stone, is an underfloor heating system that has been in continuous use on the Korean peninsula for over 2,000 years. Archaeological remains of early Ondol systems have been dated to the Bronze Age, roughly 1,000 years before the Common Era, making it the oldest known underfloor heating technology on Earth. The design is deceptively simple. A fire is lit in an external furnace, often the very same one the family uses for cooking rice. The heat and smoke from that fire never enter the living space. Instead, they are channeled into a network of stone passages called gore, built directly beneath the floor. Flat stone slabs rest on top of those passages, sealed tight with layers of red clay mud to keep every wisp of smoke from seeping into the room above. As the hot air winds through the channels, the stones drink in enormous amounts of thermal energy. The floor warms evenly, the room warms from below, and the smoke exits through a chimney on the far side of the house, having surrendered nearly all of its heat along the way. The genius reveals itself after the fire goes out. Because the mass of stone beneath the floor stores such a tremendous amount of energy, the warmth keeps radiating upward for hours, sometimes days, without any additional fuel at all. A family would light the cooking fire in the evening, prepare dinner, and the heat from that single fire would keep the floor warm through the entire night and well into the next morning. The smoke traveling beneath the house also acted as a natural pesticide, driving away insects and killing bacteria in the wooden structure above. This system shaped the entire Korean way of living. Because the floor was always the warmest surface in the room, Koreans sat on the floor, slept on the floor, and ate their meals at low tables close to the ground. They removed their shoes at the door and lived in intimate contact with the warmth radiating up beneath them. Visitors from Western countries were astonished. An American priest and doctor named Horace Allen, who visited Korea about 100 years ago, wrote that however humble the hut of a peasant, it always had its tight little sleeping room with a stone and cement floor that was kept warm by the small fire used for cooking rice twice daily. Rich or poor, everyone had access to this heat. It cost nothing beyond the fuel they were already burning to cook their meals. The efficiency was staggering. A Western fireplace radiates only about 20% of its heat into the room. The rest goes up the chimney. An Ondol system captured nearly all of the heat from the cooking fire and stored it in the floor, wasting almost nothing. When Frank Lloyd Wright encountered this system in 1914 during a visit to a home in Japan that had a Korean-style heated room, he described the sensation as an indescribable warmth and comfort, unlike anything he had experienced before. He brought the concept home and began building radiant floor heating into his most famous buildings, including Fallingwater. But here is the detail that truly defies belief. There is a documented account of one particular Ondol room, centuries old, whose stone channels and thermal design were so perfectly constructed that after a single heating, the floor stayed warm for 45 days. That room was destroyed during the Korean War in the early 1950s. Engineers reconstructed it in 1982. And even the rebuilt version, which could not perfectly replicate the original craftsmanship, held its warmth for 10 days in spring and 3 full days in the dead of winter, when the outside temperature dropped below 14 degrees Fahrenheit. 45 days of heat from one fire, no electricity, no gas line, no monthly bill, no thermostat, just stone, smoke, and a civilization that understood heat at a level we have almost entirely forgotten. From soapstones wrapped in flannel to Ondol floors that held warmth for weeks, from the 2-ton Russian pechka where families slept on warm bricks to a $50 rocket mass heater that runs on a handful of sticks, every one of these methods shares the same quiet truth. Heat was never meant to come from a wire. It was meant to come from understanding, from paying close attention to what the world already provides and learning how to hold on to it. The Koreans understood it 3,000 years ago. The Russians built it into the center of every home. Pioneer families carried it in their wagons and tucked it into their beds. And then, somewhere along the way, we decided that a thermostat and a monthly utility bill were good enough, and we let all of it slip away. The next time the power goes out and the temperature drops, you will have a choice. You can sit in a cold house and wait for someone to fix the grid. Or you can close the doors, seal the gaps, heat a brick, wrap yourself in wool, open the south-facing curtains, and remember what your grandparents knew all along. The heat was always there. You just have to know where to find it. And if this is your first time here, welcome. This is what we do. We go back and find the things that worked before the modern world decided it knew better. Pull up a chair and stay a while. If any of this changed the way you think about staying warm, when the lights go out, like this, and subscribe. Then share it with someone who needs to hear it before the next storm rolls in.